Now, I want to get away from democracy, and as a final step for today, look literally at Asian values, okay? The Asian barometer was kind of invented and has been coordinated from Taiwan. My colleague Chu Yun Han and his mentor, Professor Hu Fu, have developed all these clever, very sensitive and revealing survey items to try and test the Asian values thesis. They give people value statements that reflect so-called Asian values, and they say, do you agree or disagree? And they put a pretty high burden on the liberal dimension, because there's always a response bias to agree in a public opinion survey. You're standing there, the respondent or on the phone, you know, is there. They don't want to really disagree with something you say. So they got to feel a little more strongly to disagree with a statement than to agree with it. And to have a democratic value orientation with any of these things, you've got to disagree with the statement that government leaders are like the head of a family. We should all follow their decisions. So the paternalistic element of Asian culture. The government should decide whether certain ideas should be allowed to circulate in society. Again, paternalism and the danger of disorder if there's too much free discussion or if there are too many groups organizing in society. Strong executive leadership has to prevail over the judiciary, so judges should accept the instruction of the executive branch. The executive has to be elevated over the legislature. It won't be able to accomplish great things. A classic Confucian statement. If we have political leaders who are morally upright, we can just let them decide everything. What's this business about having grubby, clientelistic politicians competing for people's votes? If we have too many different ways of thinking in a society, again, the pluralism dimension, there'll be chaos. When the country is facing a difficult situation, it's okay for the government to disregard the law. Okay, 10 statements, or what is it, 8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, let's see how countries have sorted themselves out in terms of these Asian value statements. We're looking now at the liberal orientation. What percentage of the public in these countries disagree with these Asian value statements? And what do you see here? What does this tell you? Is there any generalization you would make, or is there anything that strikes you here? Yeah?
The more advanced economies tend to reject this.
Okay, well, Japan, now we have Hong Kong. The latest level of disagreement is 2/3. Korea, 63%. Taiwan, 79%. Okay, Singapore's, is the one advanced industrial country here that is more kind of Asian values, more deferential. But the four kind of more democracy, or at least Hong Kong rule of law, open society, they have a very liberal and non-Confucian, even though they all have Confucian cultural inheritances, orientations here. Okay, and note the difference, both with mainland China here and other countries. Okay, that's one of them. Government leaders are like the head of a family. We should all follow their decisions. Now the government should decide whether certain ideas should be discussed in society. More nervousness about rejecting this in Korea, but about 3 in 5 still do. 2/3 do in Hong Kong, a classic freedom of expression society, except until now when Communist Party of China is trying to strangle that. 87% in Japan, 81% in Taiwan, and then note the difference, about a 45% level of rejection of this, 30% in Mongolia, and of course in the communist country of Vietnam, it's very low. Malaysia, surprisingly low, given that it soon thereafter made a transition to democracy. Okay, when judges decide important cases, they should accept the view of the executive branch. And again, you basically see the same pattern. The advanced industrial democracies of Asia are pretty more in the liberal direction. There is, more ambivalence elsewhere. Why Malaysia is only at this level? My interpretation would be that, it was still pretty much an authoritarian, competitive authoritarian system. The regime had been drilling a lot of this into the public, but there was a substantial minority of the public anyway that wanted a more liberal and open society. But it's a fair question. And Malaysia, there's a lot of ambivalence, but I think the corruption scandal in Malaysia tilted it in a more democratic direction, and then the incumbent government was defeated in the election last year. Anything else? Yeah? Anybody have a reaction?
It's just slightly different point. So.
A different point.
Yeah.
Anyone want to reply to this point?
One factor could be something that we mentioned in earlier classes, that people could be afraid to speak their honest minds about how they feel about the current system, and also the exposure to propaganda.
Hey, let me ask you this question. We've got a communist country in which the Communist Party is supreme over the people, which has been drilling in communist ideology and denigrating and censoring liberal values for, decades. There was a period of more intellectual and political openness, and it's really kind of been closed again in recent years. There's another way of looking at this, which is to say, in this, the most powerful communist country in the world, you now have 40% of the public saying when judges decide important cases, they should not accept the view of the executive branch. And that level is actually higher than in the democratic Philippines, no less high than in Thailand, not much lower than in Indonesia, and higher than in Singapore. Yeah, and quite different than in Vietnam. You could say that 44% of the Chinese public disagreeing with the idea that the government should be able to censor which ideas should be allowed to be discussed in society is interesting, and there is a slight improvement, at least over time. Less of a interesting story here. And if you aggregate all of these 8 democratic value statements, the average level of Chinese public support for these democratic value statement is, again, about 4 in 10. Now, the message I take away from this is that with all the ideological assets of the Chinese Communist Party, nearly total control of information and indoctrination at the normative value level in the school system, in terms of messaging, what people are getting in terms of the normative statements of public officials and so on. The fact that you could have 4 in 10 Chinese basically embracing, on average, liberal democratic rather than, quote, Asian authoritarian values, I think is fairly striking. And if you separate out the 4, advanced industrial democracy or rule of law states in Asia, and just look at the others, China is not out of sync with the others, even though it has the most comprehensive and now Orwellian information control system. So that's another way of looking at it, yeah? So it certainly would imply that, wouldn't it? It certainly would imply that. But the honest answer is we don't fully know. First of all, we can't fully know how entirely accurate these data are. I think they're not overstating the identification with liberal values. They might be somewhat understating it, but when you get to the value questions, rather than things that relate more to the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, people probably feel more free to say what they honestly think. I think the most important thing I can say, or at least what I think most precisely about this, is that we won't fully know until the next political crisis in the People's Republic of China. And then we may see if there's 40% or more of the public wanting a more open society, we may see them, as we did in 1989 in Tiananmen Square, which we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of, taking more opportunity to say that. Anyway, this is the kind of portrait today, and this is the trend line in terms of support for 6 classic democratic value statements that have been asked since 1987. I'll come back to this on Wednesday, but there's an interesting story here about the impact of socioeconomic development, globalization, and just the functioning of democracy in terms of the growth of liberal democratic sentiment in Taiwan.